Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what recent engagement its ministers have had with disabled people's organisations to discuss any concerns of disabled people.
Minister Colcap-Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On the 13th of November, I met with the disabled people's organisations and opposition party members to discuss the Disability Equality Plan. Disabled people are struggling and change is urgently needed. We are determined to do everything we can to address the challenges faced by disabled people, and that's why the Scottish Budget has prioritised action to address these challenges, investing an additional £2 million into the plan. Following publication of the budget, I met with the disabled people's organisations on the 5th of December to discuss next steps, and I look forward to continuing our work together to build towards a fairer Scotland.
Paul O'Kane.
I thank the Minister for her answer. And the Minister knows that I have raised concerns on the sufficiency of support being provided to disabled people in terms of the challenges that are faced across Scotland. And I know the Minister is trying to work cross-portfolio on these issues, but we do have to take cognizance of the fact that delays to the LDAN bill or the Disabled Young People's Transition Strategy have been very concerning, and most recently I've raised the issue of promised health checks to people who have learning disabilities not happening. I think disabled people and DPOs want to see a renewed focus to deliver on those concerns when we return from recess in the new year. So can I ask the Minister what concrete action can the disabled community expect in the new year, in 2025, to finally address in full those concerns I have mentioned and tackle a significant challenge faced, not least of which is a disproportionately high poverty rate? Minister.
I thank Paul O'Kane for his interest, and I thank him for acknowledging the hard work that is going on in collaboration and in cooperation. We continue to do that. We are committed to delivering positive change for disabled people, as I have already mentioned, the £2 million to enhance the Disability Equality Plan in recognition of the work that is needed to improve disabled people's lives. We introduced the pension age disability payment, which is worth between £290 and £434 a month to people of state pension age and over who are disabled. The child winter heating payment will help households with severely disabled children manage the additional costs that they face this winter. We've also secured an agreement of energy suppliers, consumer organisations and the disabled people's organisations to co-design a social tariff mechanism to evidence its viability. And after recess, I will continue to work in collaboration cross-party and with the DPOs to advance further steps.
Thank you. Question number 2, Humza Yousaf.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide further details on the implementation of its social isolation and loneliness strategy, Recovering Our Connections 2023 to 2026, particularly in relation to urban areas.
Minister Colcap-Stewart.
Thank you for the question. The Scottish Government acknowledges that loneliness is a public health issue that impacts people across Scotland. Our December budget confirmed funding in 2025-26 to support projects tackling social isolation and loneliness through our Social Isolation Loneliness Fund. The fund supports the delivery of our Social Isolation and Loneliness Delivery Plan, and we are providing £3.8 million over 3 years to 53 community projects across Scotland that provides opportunities for people to connect. 26 out of the 53 funded organisations are based in urban areas such as Edinburgh, Glasgow, to which the member has his constituency, Aberdeen, Stirling and Inverness.
Humza Yousaf.
Can I thank the Minister for a very detailed response? There are a number of excellent organisations and community groups in my constituency and, of course, indeed, right across Scotland that do so much to combat isolation, especially during the Christmas and festive period. There are too many to mention, quite frankly, in Glasgow Pollock. However, I will give a special mention to Swamp, Tea in the Pot, Govan Craft Cafe, and the many faith organisations and groups in my constituency. Does the Minister agree with me that local community organisations play a vital role in combating isolation and loneliness, often supporting people that other services cannot reach. And will she join me in congratulating the staff and crucially volunteers in my Glasgow Pollock constituency and right across Scotland for their invaluable service in helping to combat loneliness and isolation this Christmas and during the festive period?
Minister.
Thank you. I would agree with him, and he mentioned tea in the pot, and I'm aware that my Cabinet Secretary has in fact visited that excellent service. I would also like to thank the people of Pollock for their tenacity, resilience and community spirit. The Scottish Government and myself personally recognise the contribution made by community-based organisations in responding to local needs. Community activity brings positive changes to people's lives, and that's why this government remains a strong advocate for the third sector. We remain committed to empowering communities to do things for themselves and make their voices heard in the planning and delivery of services.
Faisal Chowdhury.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. While Christmas is a happy time for many, for some it can be the most difficult and lonely time of the year. Social isolation services like befriending have been shown to greatly improve well-being. Can the Minister advise how the Scottish Government is ensuring people who need these services are offered them, including referrals from other public services like the NHS or schools?
First Minister. Minister.
Thank you for the question. We have identified priority groups for the Social Isolation and Loneliness Fund. For instance, young people, disabled people, people with a mental health condition, older people and people living in areas of deprivation or on a low income. Alongside members of the advisory group, we are analysing the impact of the Social Isolation and Loneliness Fund that has reached just over 11,000 people in year one. Our delivery plan also contains a number of actions aimed to stimulate activity across government and beyond that helps tackle the stigma associated with loneliness and provides opportunities for people to connect.
Question number 3, Graham Simpson.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what it is doing to address wait times in temporary accommodation. Mr.
Paul McLennan.
Increasing the supply of affordable and social housing is key to reducing the time spent in temporary accommodation. The proposed 2025-26 Affordable Housing Supply Programme budget of £768 million more than reinstates funding to 23-24 levels. Additional investment of £42 million in affordable housing this year has been targeted to 5 local authorities in the Central Belt, with sustained temporary accommodation pressures to increase the supply of social and affordable homes through acquisitions and bringing empty social homes back into use. We are also working with energy suppliers to address issues to ensure empty social homes can be turned around more quickly.
Graham Simpson.
Can I thank the Minister for that answer, but I'm sure he'll agree with me that some of the waiting times in temporary accommodation have been absolutely appalling. There was one case in South Lanarkshire where a child spent 420 days in temporary accommodation. There was an adult who endured a 760-day stay. That's just unacceptable. So, given that the First Minister earlier said we are not building enough houses, does the Minister agree with me that we need a better approach and that it actually should be targeted at those areas most in need?
Minister.
A few points. First of all, and I'll touch on some other actions that we're taking. First of all, there was a capital budget cut last year from the Tory government, and I think that's an important part. We also had the freezing of the local housing allowance, so these are important contexts. I think in addition to the £42 million acquisition I talked about, there are other actions that this year's budget is looking at. £4 million for additional funding for homelessness provision, £2 million for empty homes initiatives, and we're also spending £90 million and continue to do so even under this Labour government in discretionary housing payment. To come back to the point I mentioned about the £768 million, that's going to produce 8,000 homes. We're also looking at, in terms of, well, and Mr Simpson knows this, and we've discussed this as well, is also about the housing bill and talking about prevention duties as well. So this government is taking a number of actions in regards to homelessness and will continue to do so.
Question number 4, Willie Coffey.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of the benefits of the Scottish Welfare Fund for constituents in Kilmarnock and Irvine Valley.
Cabinet Secretary Shirley Ann Somerville.
The Scottish Welfare Fund provides an essential source of crisis support and helps people with independent living in Scotland. Last year, people in Kilmarnock and Irvine Valley benefited from nearly 1,800 community care grants, totalling over £765,000 and almost 3,500 crisis grants with a value of over £168,000. Those living in Mr Coffey's constituency will also benefit from the additional funding for East Ayrshire Council from the recently announced £20 million investment into the fund. This is on top of the £1.1 million funding already provided by the Scottish Government for the Council this year.
Willie Coffey.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply? In 2023-24, over £1.3 million of Scottish Welfare Fund support came to East Ayrshire alone, benefiting my constituents during the worst of the cost of living crisis. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline what role the Welfare Fund is due to play in the year ahead in the Scottish Government's priority mission to eradicate child poverty?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Mr Coffey is quite right to point out to the important role that the Scottish Welfare Fund has within our benefits and support system, presiding officer, and it is a key priority for the Scottish Government to continue that essential source of support for those in crisis. But we also must do what we can to continue to press the UK Government to take the actions at source, such as an essentials guarantee, which would lift people out of poverty, would cure that systemic challenge that we have about the inadequacy of UK Government benefits, and therefore be able to ensure that the Scottish Government would have more flexibility about how we could use the Scottish Welfare Fund to support more people.
Question number 5, Carol Mockin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what levels of support are currently available to women experiencing domestic abuse.
Mr Colcap-Stewart.
Thank you. Domestic abuse is abhorrent. That is why we are providing record levels of funding to vital frontline services to support survivors. We fund Scotland's domestic abuse and forced marriage helpline to ensure round-the-clock specialist advice is available. Through our £19 million per year Delivering Equally Safe Fund, which I recently announced will be extended for another year, we support a range of organisations across Scotland to ensure that vital support to women and children is available locally. Our Victim-Centred Approach Fund will provide £18.5 million for specialist advocacy support for survivors between 2022 and 2025.
Carol Mockin.
Thank you. Can I thank the Minister for that answer? I know violence against women and girls is a priority for this Minister and, of course, the Scottish Government. The Minister will know, according to Police Scotland, between April and September 2024, the number of domestic abuse crimes have risen by 2,028 since last year. In addition to this, we know through Scottish Women's Aid that on average 25% of women who have suffered economic abuse report that it continues after leaving their abuser. And so with this in mind, what has the Government done or could be doing to protect and support the rising number of women who experience and survive domestic abuse with that particular experience of economic abuse after they leave?
Minister.
Well, as I said, domestic abuse is a total blight on our society, and we've had extensive discussions during the 16 days of activism against violence against women and girls. I acknowledge that there has been a small increase in the number of incidents that have been reported to the police, but we know that many of these crimes go unreported. I would encourage victims to seek help and support. We are continuing to make changes to the justice system to make it easier to report incidents, and we have legislated to give police, prosecutors and the courts greater powers to tackle domestic abuse crimes. We are also taking steps to address financial abuse, and that is quite clearly set out in our Delivering Equally Safe plan that is jointly delivered through partnership with stakeholders and with local authorities and the Scottish Government. And I'd also like to take the opportunity just quickly to highlight the £500,000 fund, the pilot that was the fund to leave. That provided financial support to women who were leaving an abusive relationship, and the assessment is nearly at the end stage, and I will be able to report back soon.
Thank you. I'm really keen to get in all members who have pressed and concise questions and responses would help in that regard, and I call Tess White.
Minister and Cabinet Secretary, I've been contacted by women's support services in my region about the devastating impact of Labour's national insurance hikes. One service estimates that it will cost £9,000 and their budgets are already cut to the bone. They've got waiting lists of 6 months or more. It will likely have to lose a practitioner, and the impact on survivors is going to be absolutely awful. So please, what action, and they are watching today for your answer on this, what action is the Scottish Government taking to ensure the sustainability of these vital services so that all survivors receive the vital support they need? Thank you.
Minister.
I'm aware of time, so I will be brief. I acknowledge that this is a massive impact on the third sector, and I think we would all appreciate if everyone in this chamber could join on pressing the UK Government to actually address their economic decisions which are having an impact.
Thank you. Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I share the concern of many of my constituents with the news that the Highland Council is considering plans to invite a single provider to deliver domestic abuse services for all genders across the Highlands. I know first-hand the invaluable levels of expertise and knowledge that exist within the women's groups in the Highlands, and any changes which could limit access to support for women in need require careful discussion. Can I therefore ask the Minister what the Scottish Government is doing to ensure that women in the Highlands and Islands can access specialised local domestic abuse services?
Minister.
The Scottish Government is committed to supporting frontline services that provide crucial support to survivors of domestic abuse. Through the Delivering Equally Safe, we fund local women's aid services in the Highlands, including Lochaber Women's Aid, Caithness and Sutherland Women's Aid, Inverness Women's Aid and Rothshire Women's Aid. The Scottish Government cannot interfere with local authority autonomy and procurement procedures, including the commissioning of domestic abuse services. We encourage local authorities to utilise the joint COSLA and Scottish Women's Aid guidance on good practice in commissioning specialist domestic abuse services.
Thank you. Question number 6, Sandesh Gulhani.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what it is doing to tackle any fraud in Social Security Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
Social Security Scotland has a zero-tolerance approach to fraud. They have published a counter-fraud strategy and have counter-fraud response measures in place to proactively identify and tackle emergent fraud risks. Where Social Security Scotland have good reason to believe that fraud has taken place, they will investigate and make efforts to stop ongoing financial loss and will seek to recover payments. Where appropriate to do so, Social Security Scotland will make a report to the Crown Office in relation to cases of suspected fraud.
Sandesh Gulhani.
Scotland's Benefit Agency has referred just one person to prosecutors, despite receiving almost 8,000 allegations of fraud, and that one case was subsequently dropped. So much for a zero-tolerance approach. Surely the Cabinet Secretary must share my concern, and these figures should send alarm bells through government unless the Cabinet Secretary believes there is simply no fraud. So will she protect taxpayers' money and look at the robustness and staffing levels of the anti-fraud team?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I extend an invitation to the member to actually meet with Social Security Scotland to go through exactly what is in place? Because I appreciate the points and the figures that he has laid out. But I would say to him, it does not necessarily reflect that there is an issue in the system. And I think it would be useful, rather than what we can go through in the chamber, to talk through exactly what happens with the claims that come in around fraudulent activity and exactly the very, very detailed processes around current fraud risk and the suspected fraudulent activity and what exactly happens. There is an enormous amount we could go into, Presiding Officer, around the investigative methodology and data analysis and the working with partners to approve the appropriate response for fraud. Not all will be something that should go to the Crown Office, but there is very, very stringent measures in place within the agency, and I would invite the member to meet with the agency to talk through this in details. And if he still has any concerns, I would be happy to discuss those with him in detail.
Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary will agree it's vital to minimise any fraud, not just on Social Security Scotland, and be aware that the UK taxpayer was defrauded of tens of billions of pounds during the COVID pandemic, from dodgy personal protection equipment to some employers falsely claiming furlough payments. What cooperation has there been between the Scottish and UK governments in trying to recover this and money lost through tax evasion by wealthy individuals?
I'm not wholly content that that relates to the substantive question. So I think we will move on to question number 7, and I call Gordon MacDonald. Mr. Gibson, I have ruled, and I call Gordon MacDonald for question number 7.
To ask the Scottish Government, in light of the announcement in its draft budget 25-26 that it plans to mitigate the UK Government's two-child benefit cap policy in Scotland, what it estimates the cost will be of doing so per affected child.
Cabinet Secretary.
Universal Credit Child Element is currently worth £287.92 per month for the first 2 children in a household, and mitigation will seek to make a payment equal to the Universal Credit Child Element for each eligible third and subsequent child in a household impacted by the cap. At current levels, that would be almost £3,500 per child per year. CPAG, the Child Poverty Action Group, estimates that mitigating the 2-child limit in Scotland could lift around 15,000 children out of poverty.
Gordon MacDonald.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. The Labour Government that promised change has left it to the devolved governments to mitigate the most pernicious and costly Tory austerity measures like the 2-child limit. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline the total cost to the Scottish Government of all the UK Government policies that are being mitigated, including the 2-child benefit cap?
Cabinet Secretary.
Next year in our draft budget, mitigating the impacts of UK Government policies will rise to over £210 million per year, an increase of over £56 million. This includes spending over £99 million on discretionary housing payments to mitigate the bedroom tax and the benefit cap, maintaining our £41 million commitment to the Scottish Welfare Fund, which provides crisis support and helps eligible people to establish independent living, and around £70 million above the block grant adjustments to mitigate the winter fuel payment cut, ensuring all pensioners' households will receive a minimum £100 of support next winter. And, Presiding Officer, I noted with some disbelief that only yesterday the Secretary of State for the Department of Work and Pensions seemed to suggest that despite this Parliament and this Government not having the powers, that somehow it's up to the Scottish Government to also alleviate the critical situation of the WASPI women. And once again, that is a deep disappointment and an abdication of the responsibility of the UK Government on this and indeed the other areas that we mitigate against.
Liz Smith.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, the Finance Cabinet Secretary said in her statement to the budget that there would be information required, data information required from the DWP before the Scottish Government could set a cost to this mitigation. Could the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security spell out exactly what data would be required and how that will be implemented for this policy?
Cabinet Secretary.
We do need some additional information and data sharing with the DWP. That work has now begun with the DWP. Letters have been exchanged, and the officials from both Social Security Directorate within the Scottish Government and the DWP are now working with that. I would be happy to provide the data that we think is still required. It may still change because we are working through that, and we are in essence in the first sprint of the discovery phase for what needs to happen on that. So with the caveat that it may change with that discovery work, I'd be happy to provide Liz Smith with that information.
Question number 8, Claire Hawley.
To ask the Scottish Government how the measures announced in its draft budget 2025-26 will support its mission to eradicate child poverty.
Cabinet Secretary.
The Scottish Budget for 25-26 prioritises action to eradicate child poverty, outlining wide-ranging investment to support progress on this national mission. In addition to our continued investment in measures such as the Scottish Child Payment, early learning and childcare and free bus travel, we have announced increased investment in the affordable housing supply and the expansion of breakfast clubs and free school meals. Importantly, we have also committed to spend £3 million to develop the systems necessary to effectively scrap the impact of the two-child cap in 2026, and CPAG estimate that scrapping the two-child limit in Scotland could lift 15,000 children out of poverty.
Claire Hawley.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Poverty campaigners have made clear that for child poverty to be eradicated in Scotland, policymakers cannot work in a silo. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline how the First Minister's 4 priority missions support one another, and how the draft budget ensures low-income households in Scotland are set to benefit not only from more generous and comprehensive social security than the rest of the UK, but also from a thriving green economy and improved public services?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Claire Hawkey is quite right to point out that with the eradication of child poverty being a defining mission of this government, it is not just for this portfolio, but indeed for all ministers to take exceptionally seriously, which is why we have the cross-government response that we do, and I believe that the budget demonstrates that, presiding officer, whether we see that through the investment in employability, whether we see that in the investment in housing, or indeed in social security, where we have the universal winter fuel payment being reintroduced, and that work for the two-child cap. That's a small but significant sample of the work that's in that budget. But, presiding officer, that support for people will only happen if this budget is passed and if Parliament votes for it. So the important work that we are all obligated to do to eradicate child poverty can only be done if the budget is passed by Parliament.
Thank you. That concludes portfolio questions, and we move to decision time. And there are no questions to be put as a result of today's business, so I'll take this opportunity to wish all members and all staff in Parliament a very merry and peaceful Christmas. And we will now move on to members' business in the name of Pam Gossel. Thank you.